The night was dark and silent, save for the occasional gust of wind that sent dust swirling across the empty streets. A chill had settled in, the kind of cold that made it feel as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the stillness. Beneath the harsh glow of the streetlights, the silhouette of a tiny, crumpled figure lay at the edge of an alleyway, hidden beneath a thin, torn blanket. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to be alone. A baby, barely a year old, though no one could say for sure, lay on the cold pavement, her small body curled into itself for warmth. Her face was partially covered, but the slight twist of her lips and the delicate features of her face told a story. There was something different about her, something the world had already rejected. The baby's cries were soft at first, like the whimper of a wounded animal. She had no idea where her parents were, or why they had abandoned her. Was it her fault? Was it the way she looked? Her small hand clutched at the blanket, as though it could somehow protect her from the harsh reality she now found herself in. The rain began to fall lightly, splashing against the ground. It was as if the heavens themselves wept for her. But still, no one came. Across the street, a car drove past, its headlights slicing through the darkness. A figure in the driver's seat glanced over but never slowed down. The world, it seemed, had moved on without a second thought. The cries of the child faded into the background as the car disappeared into the night. No one stopped. No one cared. In the quiet solitude of the alley, the baby's cries eventually became nothing more than a faint echo, absorbed by the city's endless hum. She was abandoned. Left to fend for herself in a world that had already cast her aside. But the world wasn't done with her yet. Across town, two people were walking down a similar dark street. They had no idea what fate had in store for them, or what the night would bring. Their lives were about to be torn apart in ways they never thought possible. They had made their choice, and now they would have to live with the consequences. Lena and Jake had always been a couple filled with dreams and plans. But life, as it often does, had thrown them a curveball. They had expected the birth of their child to be a blessing, a joy they would cherish for the rest of their lives. But the moment they saw her, everything changed. The doctors had warned them, but nothing could prepare them for what they saw. Lena's heart sank as she looked down at the tiny face of her daughter. The doctors called it a facial difference, but to them, it was something far worse. A deformity. Her face, soft and innocent, yet so different from what they had imagined, was twisted in a way that made their hearts ache with a mix of fear and guilt. There was a time when they had believed their love could overcome anything. But now, the reality of their situation was hitting them like a truck. What would people think? How would they live their lives with a child who looked so different? Lena couldn't bring herself to look at her daughter anymore. Every time she did, the guilt grew heavier. She kept wondering, would she be happy? Would she be loved? Jake, too, had a hard time accepting their child. He had always been the optimistic one, the one who believed in second chances. But even he couldn't shake the sense of dread that seemed to hang over them like a cloud. How would society treat their daughter? Would they be cruel to her? Would she feel rejected by the world? As weeks turned into months, the couple's relationship grew strained. Conversations turned into arguments, and the silence between them became deafening. They tried to make it work, they really did, but every time they looked at their daughter, their hearts felt as though they were breaking into a million pieces. They had no answers. No solutions. Eventually, their hope had all but disappeared. They were trapped, suffocated by the weight of their guilt and confusion. They couldn't bear to look at the child they had once dreamed of raising, and they couldn't fathom a future where they could give her the love and care she needed. One night, after a long, painful conversation that neither of them wanted to have, they made a decision. They would leave her. It wasn't the decision either of them had ever imagined making, but at that moment, it felt like the only option. They thought they were doing what was best for their daughter, giving her a chance at life without the weight of their inability to love her the way she deserved. The next morning, they packed a small bag for her, put a few essentials inside, and placed it beside her on the cold pavement. They kissed her forehead, their hearts breaking as they whispered goodbye. And then they left. Hours later, the baby was still alone, her cries now growing weaker. The sound of footsteps was drowned out by the rain, and no one came to save her. Just as her tiny body began to tremble from the cold, the distant sound of sirens could be heard in the distance. Someone had finally noticed her. Someone had finally called for help. But even as she was rushed to the nearest hospital, her fate remained uncertain. Was she truly abandoned? Or had the world just been too blind to see her? 18 years passed. The baby, now a young woman named Chloe, grew up in the foster care system. Her face, still bearing the marks of her early abandonment, had become something that defined her, something she could never escape. But Chloe was stronger than anyone could have imagined. She refused to be defined by her past. She had dreams. She had hope. And above all, she had a strength that no one could take away from her. By the time she turned 18, Chloe had carved out a life for herself. She had built relationships with people who saw her for who she was, not the scars on her face. She had worked hard to become a successful musician, and now, she stood at the precipice of her biggest opportunity yet, a concert that would change her life forever. But as Chloe prepared for her performance, something unexpected happened. The two people who had abandoned her all those years ago walked into the venue. Her parents. And they were about to learn the truth. They had come to hear her sing. They had come to see the daughter they had left behind. But what they didn't know was that Chloe was no longer the fragile, abandoned child they had once known. She was a woman. Strong, confident, and ready to face them. The moment they locked eyes, everything changed. There would be no turning back. Chloe was no longer the baby they had left in that alley. She was someone they would never forget. But what would they do now? Could they face the consequences of their actions? Would they ever be able to live with the truth? The reunion would be nothing short of shocking. And it was only just beginning. At the end of part 1, Chloe stands backstage, waiting for her moment to take the stage. The air is thick with anticipation, but her mind is focused on one thing, the encounter with her parents. She knows that this moment will define the rest of her life. What will happen when the truth comes to light? How will the world react? The story, for Chloe, is just starting. The journey she thought she understood has taken an unexpected turn. And no one, not even her parents, could have prepared for what was about to unfold. This setup introduces key emotional struggles, sets the stage for a shocking reunion, and leaves readers with questions that will drive the suspense through to the next parts. Would you like to adjust any elements, or is there something more you'd like to explore further? Chloe stepped backstage, the hum of the crowd's excitement drifting through the walls. The venue was packed, and her heart raced with a mix of nerves and anticipation. This concert was everything she had worked for, every dream she had held onto since she could remember. Music was the only thing that had ever felt truly hers, the only constant in a life filled with uncertainty. But today was different. Tonight, as she was about to step into the spotlight, something else was pulling at her, the knowledge that her parents were out there, sitting somewhere in the audience. After 18 years of silence, they had somehow found her. And now, they would see her, hear her sing, see her live the life she had built from nothing. She tried to push the thought from her mind, but it wouldn't go away. It was like a knot in her stomach, tightening with each passing minute. What would they think of her now? The baby they had abandoned, now a woman on the brink of something bigger than they could have ever imagined. Her manager, Rachel, stood nearby, adjusting Chloe's microphone and offering her a reassuring smile. "You ready for this?" she asked, her voice low, almost conspiratorial. Chloe nodded, but it felt mechanical. She wasn't sure if she was ready. "Your performance is going to be amazing," Rachel continued, her tone brightening. "You've worked hard for this moment. Don't let anyone steal your shine. Not even them." Chloe gave a half-smile, but the words didn't comfort her. The pressure was building, not just from the crowd, but from the looming encounter with her parents. They were out there, somewhere in that crowd, waiting to see their daughter for the first time in nearly 2 decades. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to breathe through the tension. The sound of the crowd grew louder, the excitement palpable. Chloe had been performing for years, but tonight felt different. Tonight was personal. Too personal. The lights above flickered and the stage manager waved toward her. 5 minutes, Chloe," he called. "All right," she muttered under her breath. She ran her hands over her face, forcing herself to stay grounded. Her mind drifted to the years that had passed since she last saw her parents. The memory of that alley, of being left there alone, was one she tried to suppress, but it would never fully disappear. It wasn't just the coldness of the pavement or the harshness of the rain. It was the abandonment, the feeling of being unwanted, of being forgotten. That moment had shaped who she was today, someone resilient, determined, but still carrying a weight she couldn't shake. She had learned to live without them. To survive without them. In foster care, she had found other forms of love, other families. But nothing had ever filled the void they left behind. And now, standing on the edge of her biggest moment, she was about to face them. To look them in the eye and wonder, what would they feel? Regret? Guilt? Or would they just pretend like nothing had happened? The last time she saw them was the day she was taken into foster care. They had walked out of the hospital, leaving her behind without a second glance. The social worker who took her into care had told her about the circumstances, how her parents had just disappeared, leaving her with nothing but a note and a few belongings in a ragged bag. No one ever understood why they abandoned her, and Chloe had spent years trying to make sense of it. She pushed all the thoughts aside as the music swelled in the background, signaling that her time was almost here. The first song of the evening would be one that always brought her peace, an old ballad her foster mother had taught her as a child. It was about resilience, about survival, about rising from the ashes. She could already hear the first notes echoing through the speakers. The lights dimmed, and the room went quiet. The curtain lifted, and Chloe walked onto the stage. The bright lights hit her like a wave, blinding at first. She could feel the heat of the spotlight on her skin, and for a moment, everything was surreal. The crowd erupted into applause, but Chloe barely noticed. She was already lost in the music. She grabbed the microphone, her fingers steady despite the storm of thoughts racing through her mind. Her heart thudded in her chest, but she couldn't let it show. Not tonight. Tonight, the world was hers. Tonight, she was going to sing her truth. The first notes of the ballad filled the air, and Chloe's voice, raw and unpolished yet beautiful, began to rise. The lyrics were simple, but they spoke to her soul. The crowd hushed, as if they too felt the weight of her voice. But as the song progressed, she saw them. Her parents. They were sitting near the back, their faces almost unrecognizable, but she knew them instantly. The same eyes. The same expressions. Their bodies were stiff with uncertainty, their faces pale under the lights. Her mother's hands were folded in her lap, her father's jaw clenched tightly, as if he was trying to control his emotions. Chloe's breath caught in her throat. Her voice faltered for just a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. She couldn't let them see her break. She couldn't let them see the pain they had caused her, the anger she had carried with her for so many years. But as the song continued, the weight of it all grew too much to bear. She sang louder, her voice now filled with raw emotion, but the flood of memories, the abandonment, the years of unanswered questions, threatened to overwhelm her. Her heart ached in ways it hadn't in years. Her parents were watching her, but neither of them made a move. They just sat there, frozen in place, as if they were unsure of how to react. The crowd seemed to sense the tension, and for a moment, the room fell into an eerie silence. Chloe's song ended with a final, aching note. The crowd cheered, but Chloe didn't hear it. She was only focused on the two figures in the back of the room, the two people who had given her life and then ripped it away. The spotlight softened, and Chloe stood there, her chest heaving with emotion. She had spent so many years rehearsing this moment in her mind, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure how to handle it. Her parents slowly stood up, and Chloe watched as they made their way toward the side of the stage, their steps hesitant, like they were walking toward something they couldn't undo. The realization hit her all at once, this was it. The moment she had dreaded and longed for. The confrontation she never thought would happen. Chloe, her father's voice was thick with emotion, but it sounded foreign to her. It had been so long since she had heard it. She cut him off before he could finish. Don't. The word was sharp, cutting through the air between them. Her voice wavered, but there was strength in it. She wasn't a child anymore. She wasn't the abandoned baby lying in the alley. She was someone who had lived, who had survived, and who had learned to forgive herself long before they ever asked for forgiveness. Her mother's eyes filled with tears, but Chloe couldn't bring herself to feel anything but anger. After all these years? After everything they had done to her? How could they just show up now? After all the pain, the loneliness, the uncertainty. You left me, Chloe said, her voice hoarse. You abandoned me. And now you want to act like you didn't? Like you can just walk back into my life? She shook her head, the anger burning bright in her chest. Her father took a step forward, but Chloe stepped back. I don't need your apologies. I don't need your explanations. I've made it without you. Her mother reached out to her, her voice pleading. Chloe, please. We're so sorry. You have to understand, I don't need to understand, Chloe snapped. I've had enough of your excuses. The crowd had begun to murmur, unsure of what was happening. But Chloe didn't care. She was done. The truth, however painful, had to be said. The curtain fell, and Chloe was left standing alone in the dimly lit backstage. The performance was over, but the real show, the one that had been years in the making, had just begun. The reunion was just the beginning. Chloe's heart pounded in her chest as the spotlight shone brightly down on her. She barely registered the sound of the audience, the clapping and shouting that had grown louder with each note. It felt like a distant hum in her ears, muffled and irrelevant. Her mind was far away, lost in the realization that her parents were here. In this very room. After 18 years, they had returned. She had built this moment in her mind, envisioned it hundreds of times, fantasized about the confrontation, the words she'd say, the anger and hurt she'd express. But now, with the eyes of the world on her, nothing seemed as clear as it had in the silence of her dreams. Her parents, her mother and father, were sitting together near the back of the room, barely visible in the sea of faces. They looked so different. Older. Wearier. Chloe had spent so many years imagining what it would be like to face them again. But here they were, reduced to two strangers who shared her blood. Strangers who had abandoned her when she needed them most. The music in her headphones was nothing but noise now. Chloe could feel her throat tightening, the overwhelming surge of emotions threatening to drown her. She wanted to scream, to shout, to demand answers. But the show must go on, right? She had a job to do. Her manager had always told her, keep your head in the game. But tonight, she couldn't. Her mother's face was etched with lines of sorrow, her eyes red from what Chloe could only assume were tears. She was trying to catch Chloe's gaze, but Chloe refused to meet her eyes. The anger she had carried for years flared up like a fire. They didn't deserve to look at her, didn't deserve to see her shine. Chloe pushed the microphone closer to her lips and sang louder, hoping that the rawness in her voice would drown out the emotions swirling inside her. She sang with everything she had, hoping the power of the music would take her somewhere else. But no matter how hard she tried to lose herself in the lyrics, the faces in the crowd were always there. Especially the two in the back who had once promised to love her, but had broken that promise with cold, unforgivable indifference. The song ended abruptly, and the crowd erupted into applause, but Chloe felt no relief. She stood there, frozen, her chest rising and falling rapidly. The silence that followed felt like an eternity, and she could hear her breath echoing in her ears. Her manager, Rachel, had been right. The performance had been amazing. Chloe had sung with power and passion, but the real battle was happening within her, an internal conflict she didn't know how to win. The house lights came on, and Chloe scanned the audience one last time. Her parents were still there, still staring at her. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw her mother wipe her eyes, her face a mask of guilt and longing. But Chloe wasn't sure what she felt anymore. Was it anger? Disappointment? Or was it something worse, something deeper and more painful? A shiver ran down her spine, and before she could stop herself, Chloe turned toward the side of the stage. Rachel was watching her, her face tense with concern. Chloe hadn't said a word about her parents being in the audience. She hadn't had the chance. Rachel had no idea what was going through her mind. "Are you okay?" Rachel asked softly, moving toward her. Chloe didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a deep breath and turned back toward the stage, trying to collect herself. Her hands were shaking slightly as she gripped the microphone stand. "Yeah," Chloe said, though it wasn't a convincing response. "I'll be fine." But the truth was, she wasn't sure if she could ever be fine again. Backstage, Chloe's emotions surged like a tidal wave. She knew she had to finish the show, she had to. It wasn't just about her anymore. Her bandmates were counting on her, the audience was counting on her, and most of all, she was counting on herself. She had worked too hard for this moment to let it slip away, no matter how many ghosts from her past had come to haunt her. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Each song felt like a distant memory, each note and lyric slipping through her fingers. She felt disconnected from her body, like she was singing not for herself, but for everyone else. The audience cheered, screamed, and begged for more, but Chloe couldn't shake the image of her parents sitting in the back of the venue, watching her every move. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last song ended. The crowd's applause was deafening, but Chloe barely heard it. She gave her signature bow, waved briefly to the crowd, and quickly exited the stage. Backstage, her team was congratulating her, patting her on the back, and praising her performance. But Chloe's mind was elsewhere. Rachel caught her by the arm before she could disappear into the dressing room. "Chloe, hey," Rachel said, her voice soft but firm. "You need to talk. This isn't like you." Chloe wanted to shrug it off, but the knot in her stomach wouldn't let her. "I'm fine," she lied, pulling her arm away gently. "No, you're not. I've been around you long enough to know when something's wrong." Rachel paused, her gaze searching Chloe's face. "It's them, isn't it? Your parents." Chloe's breath caught in her throat. She didn't want to talk about them. Not now. Not when everything was already so raw. "I'm not ready, Rachel," she whispered. "I don't know what to say to them." Rachel didn't push her, but Chloe could see the concern in her eyes. She had always been supportive, always tried to understand. But this was different. Rachel hadn't seen what Chloe had seen, hadn't lived through the pain and abandonment. "They're still out there, Chloe," Rachel said quietly. "You don't have to face them now, but you're going to have to deal with this at some point." Chloe nodded, her chest tight. She knew Rachel was right, but the thought of confronting them again, after everything, was unbearable. She had spent so many years learning to live without them. Learning to heal without their love or support. Could she go back now? Could she ever forgive them? Backstage, Chloe heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Before she could react, her mother appeared at the door to the dressing room. She looked hesitant, almost afraid, as she stepped into the space. Chloe's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't move. She didn't speak. She just stared at her mother, who now looked older, thinner, her eyes swollen from crying. Her mother hesitated for a moment before speaking, her voice barely audible. "Chloe, we need to talk." Chloe felt a rush of heat rise in her chest, and before she could stop herself, the words flew out of her mouth. "You left me. You abandoned me without a second thought. And now, after all these years, you think you can just walk back into my life like nothing happened?" Her mother's face crumpled, and Chloe saw the pain in her eyes. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to erase the years of hurt. The years of feeling unwanted. "We didn't want to leave you," her mother said softly, stepping closer. We thought you'd be better off without us. We were too scared to face what we had done. But we've spent every day since regretting it." Chloe couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had spent so many years imagining this moment, but now that it was happening, the words felt hollow, empty. Her father appeared behind her mother, his face tight with guilt. "Chloe, we were wrong. We should have never left you. We were selfish and scared, but we've never stopped thinking about you. Every day we wondered, is she okay?" Chloe shook her head, stepping back. "You don't get to say that. You don't get to regret it now. You had a chance, and you walked away." Her mother's voice cracked. I know we were wrong. But please, Chloe, we want to make it right. We want to be part of your life again. If you'll let us." The words hit Chloe harder than she expected. She had imagined this moment, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure what to say. What to feel. Could she forgive them? Could she ever let them back in? Before she could answer, a voice interrupted. "We need to go, now." Chloe turned to see Rachel standing in the doorway, her face tight with concern. But Chloe wasn't sure if Rachel's concern was for her or for the situation itself. She wasn't sure if she could face her parents again. But tonight wasn't the end. The reunion had only just begun. And Chloe knew that this conversation, this confrontation, was only the beginning of something far more complicated than she could have ever imagined. The evening after the show was an intense blur. The excitement of the performance, the wild applause, the roaring crowd, seemed like a distant memory compared to the weight that hung over Chloe. Back in her hotel room, she sat alone, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The stage lights were still burned into her eyes, the overwhelming sensation of being watched by thousands of strangers, but all she could think about was them. Her parents. The people who had given her life and then, without warning, had turned their backs on her. She wasn't sure what had been worse, the performance or the reunion. The show had been everything she had worked for, her escape from the pain. But tonight, that pain had come rushing back, crashing over her like a tsunami. Chloe stood up, pacing the room, feeling restless. The weight of her parents' presence was too heavy to ignore. They had finally come back into her life after nearly 2 decades of silence, and yet, she wasn't sure what to make of it. It was too much to process in a single night. Too many years of abandonment, of rejection, of unanswered questions. The knock on the door was soft, but it cut through her thoughts like a blade. "Chloe?" Rachel's voice drifted through the wood. "Can we talk?" Chloe wiped a stray tear from her cheek before she moved to open the door. Rachel stood there, her arms crossed, her eyes full of concern. She had been Chloe's manager for years, but tonight, she felt more like a friend, someone who had seen Chloe's rise from the humble beginnings to the woman standing on the stage tonight. A woman with so much talent, so much drive, but still haunted by the past. "Sure," Chloe replied, stepping aside to let Rachel in. She was trying to keep it together, trying not to let her emotions show, but it was getting harder by the minute. Rachel stepped inside, her eyes scanning Chloe's face. "You didn't look like yourself tonight. I know that was tough for you, but you still gave an incredible performance." Chloe didn't answer right away. She had no words for the performance anymore. It felt irrelevant compared to the questions swirling in her head. The feeling of her parents' eyes on her had consumed her every thought. The song they'd asked her to sing had been about survival, about rising from the ashes, but tonight, she felt like she was drowning in them. The ashes were too thick to breathe. "I don't know what to feel," Chloe finally said, her voice cracking slightly. She didn't care. At this point, it felt better to say it than to hide it. "They left me. Abandoned me. And now they want to come back like nothing happened. They think I'm going to just forgive them?" Rachel gave a small nod, her arms falling to her sides. "I don't think anyone expects you to forgive them right away. But you have to face it. This is a part of your story, Chloe. It's a part of who you are." Chloe spun on her heel, frustration bubbling inside her. "I don't want this part of my story. I don't want them in my life. I've spent years learning how to live without them. I've survived without them. And now they just show up." Rachel's voice softened. "I know it's painful. But if you keep pushing this away, it's not going to go anywhere. You can't keep running from it. You're strong, Chloe. You can handle this, even if it feels like too much right now." Chloe's chest tightened. "I don't know if I can handle them. What do I even say? I don't have the words." Rachel stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Chloe's shoulder. "You don't need words. Just take it one step at a time. You don't have to do everything tonight." But Chloe wasn't sure she could do anything at all. The idea of confronting her parents, of hearing them apologize, again, felt like an impossible task. She had spent so long building a life for herself, trying to forget them, trying to make herself whole without their love, without their support. And now they wanted back in. The question lingered, hanging in the air like a cloud. Could she forgive them? The following day, Chloe found herself at a crossroads. She couldn't avoid them forever, no matter how badly she wanted to. Rachel had insisted that she meet her parents again. To have a conversation, to finally hear their side of the story. But Chloe wasn't ready. Not yet. But something inside her told her that she had to. After everything, the anger, the resentment, wasn't it time to face the truth? Maybe, just maybe, there was something she could learn from this. Something that could help her move forward. So, reluctantly, she agreed to meet them again. They had requested a private meeting, away from the cameras, away from the noise. They wanted to explain themselves. They wanted to apologize. The meeting took place in a small cafe just outside the city center. It was quiet, almost too quiet, as if the world had come to a standstill. Chloe sat at the table, her hands folded in front of her, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Across from her, her parents sat awkwardly, their eyes darting from her to the coffee cups in front of them. Her mother looked older than Chloe remembered. Her hair was graying at the temples, and the wrinkles on her face had deepened, evidence of the years spent living with regret. Her father was thinner, his once strong features now worn down by time. But it was their eyes, those same eyes, that unsettled Chloe. They hadn't changed at all. They still held that same look of uncertainty, the same confusion that had been there all those years ago when they left her in that alley. For a moment, none of them spoke. Chloe's heart raced, but she forced herself to stay calm. She wasn't sure why they had called her here. To apologize? To make things right? How could they ever make things right? Her mother cleared her throat first. Chloe, we want to start by saying how sorry we are. I know no words can take away what we did, but we've spent years regretting our decision. Every day, we thought about you. Wondered where you were, how you were. We never stopped loving you. Chloe's stomach churned. She wanted to scream at them, to tell them how much their words didn't matter. How many nights she had spent feeling abandoned, neglected, unloved. How many birthdays, holidays, school events they had missed. How many times she had searched the crowd, hoping they would show up, only to be disappointed. But she didn't scream. She didn't say anything. Her father spoke next, his voice quieter than Chloe had expected. We were wrong. We made a mistake, and I know it. We should have fought for you. We should have stayed. But we were too selfish. We didn't understand what we had until we lost it. And now we can't change the past. But we want to make amends. We want to try to be part of your life again, if you'll let us. Chloe looked at them, at the strangers who had once been her parents, and she felt nothing but emptiness. This wasn't the reunion she had dreamed of, not the way she had imagined it. No tears, no reconciliation. Just words. Words that could never undo the damage they had caused. Her voice was barely a whisper when she spoke. How? How do you expect me to just let you back in? How do you expect me to forget everything? I've spent so long pretending you didn't exist, pretending I was okay without you. And now, you want to come back into my life? Her father's eyes filled with guilt. We don't expect you to forget. We don't expect anything from you. We just want a chance to make it right. If you can find it in your heart, Chloe, give us a chance. The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. Chloe's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at her parents, the very people who had abandoned her. A part of her wanted to forgive them. A part of her wanted to believe that they had changed, that they could be the parents she had always dreamed of. But another part, one that was much stronger, couldn't let go of the hurt, the abandonment. She didn't know what to say. Didn't know if she was ready to forgive them. Not yet. Maybe never. Give me time, she whispered, her voice breaking. I need time. Her mother nodded, her eyes filled with unshed tears. Take all the time you need. We'll be here, whenever you're ready. Chloe stood up, her legs shaky, her heart a tangled mess of emotions. She didn't know what the future held for her and her parents. Maybe this was the start of something new. Or maybe it was the beginning of a chapter that would never be fully written. Chloe left the cafe without another word. Outside, the cold air hit her like a slap in the face. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The weight of the past, of the years lost, was still with her. But at least now, she knew where her. Chloe woke up the next morning to a soft knock on her hotel room door. The sun had barely risen, and the warmth of the blanket still clung to her skin. She had barely slept the night before, her mind replaying the conversation with her parents over and over again. Their words kept echoing in her head, we want to make it right. Give us a chance. She had told them she needed time, but the truth was, she had no idea what to do with the time they had given her. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Chloe groaned, pulling herself out of bed. She wasn't sure if she was ready for another round of emotional turmoil. Not yet. But the knock persisted. She opened the door to find Rachel standing there, a cup of coffee in hand. Her expression was unreadable, but Chloe could see the worry in her eyes. You okay? Rachel asked softly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. She handed Chloe the coffee. Chloe nodded, taking the cup with a quiet, thanks. She sank into the chair by the window, her fingers wrapped around the warmth of the mug. I don't know what to think anymore, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Rachel sat down across from her, her gaze steady. It's a lot to process. I get that. She paused, looking like she wanted to say more but wasn't sure where to start. Do you want to talk about it? Chloe shook her head, her fingers tapping nervously on the side of her coffee cup. She had told Rachel what had happened yesterday, about the meeting with her parents, about the apology. But there was something more that was gnawing at her. Something she hadn't yet shared. It just feels like everything I've built up, everything I've worked for, is being torn down, Chloe said, her voice trembling. It's like I've spent all these years learning to live without them, and now they want to waltz back into my life. As if nothing happened. As if the past doesn't matter. Rachel nodded slowly. I get that. But Chloe, you have to remember, you've survived without them. You don't owe them anything. But you also don't have to shut them out forever either. You can choose what part of them you want in your life. Chloe stared out the window, her eyes distant. I don't even know if I want any part of them in my life. They left me when I was at my most vulnerable. I grew up without them. I don't know who they are anymore. And I don't know if I can let them in again. Rachel sat quietly for a moment, letting the silence hang in the air. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but insistent. You don't have to make that decision right now. You don't owe them anything. But it's okay to take your time with this. It's okay to feel conflicted. Chloe took a deep breath, trying to steady the whirlwind of emotions inside her. I don't know if I can ever forgive them. Not after everything. Rachel looked at her, her expression filled with understanding. Forgiveness doesn't mean you forget. It just means you stop letting the past control you. And sometimes, it's not about them. It's about you finding peace with it. Chloe sighed, staring at her reflection in the window. The truth was, she wasn't sure if forgiveness was possible. Her heart felt too heavy with anger and betrayal. But Rachel was right about one thing, something had to change. She couldn't carry this burden forever. Just then, Chloe's phone buzzed on the table. She reached for it, her eyes scanning the screen. It was a message from her mother. We're sorry. We know we don't deserve your forgiveness, but we hope you'll at least consider meeting us again. We can't undo the past, but we want to be a part of your future. Chloe's stomach churned as she read the message again. The words were familiar, like a broken record playing over and over. But something was different this time. She felt nothing. The anger she had carried for so long, the hurt, the fear, it was all still there, buried under a layer of numbness. She didn't know if that was a sign of healing or if it was just her mind's way of protecting her from further pain. But the words didn't sting anymore. They didn't make her feel anything. Chloe put the phone down, staring at it for a long moment before turning back to Rachel. I don't know what to do with this, she admitted. I don't know if I can ever forgive them. But I can't ignore them either. They're here. And I can't just keep pretending like they don't exist. Rachel smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. You're not alone in this, Chloe. You don't have to do it all by yourself. The next few days passed in a haze. Chloe couldn't bring herself to reach out to her parents. Every time she thought about it, she felt this overwhelming sense of fear that if she allowed them back into her life, everything she had worked for would crumble. But then, there were the moments of doubt, the quiet whispers in her mind that asked, what if they really had changed? But Chloe wasn't ready to take that chance. She needed to be sure. She needed to know that the years of pain weren't going to come rushing back if she let them in. That's when Rachel suggested something Chloe hadn't even considered, a trip back to her hometown. A place Chloe had avoided for years. A place that held the painful memories of her childhood, of being abandoned by the people who were supposed to love her unconditionally. Why would I go back there? Chloe asked, her voice laced with disbelief. There's nothing left for me there. Rachel looked at her with a knowing expression. Maybe it's not about what's left for you. Maybe it's about what you can find. The truth, Chloe. You've been running from it for too long. But you can't heal without facing it. You can't move forward without understanding why they left. Chloe hesitated. The thought of returning to the place that had haunted her for so many years felt like a step backward, not forward. But Rachel was right about one thing: the truth was the only thing that could help her move on. And maybe, just maybe, it would help her understand what really happened all those years ago. After a long pause, Chloe nodded slowly. Okay. I'll go. The drive to her hometown was quiet, the air outside heavy with the weight of unresolved history. Chloe's hands gripped the seatbelt tightly, as if it was the only thing anchoring her to reality. The roads were familiar, but it felt like a lifetime had passed since she had last been here. The small, sleepy town had changed in ways she couldn't quite describe, but in other ways, it hadn't changed at all. Rachel didn't press Chloe for answers during the drive, knowing that this was something Chloe needed to do on her own. But as they approached the old house where Chloe had spent the first few years of her life, the memories hit her like a flood. The chipped paint, the overgrown yard, the broken windows. The house was a shell of what it had once been, just like Chloe felt on the inside. She stopped the car in front of the house and stared at it for a long time. There were no words, no thoughts, just a sea of emotions crashing against her. It was like walking into a nightmare she had never fully woken up from. "I'm not ready," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. Rachel nodded, not saying a word. She knew that sometimes, the hardest thing was simply taking that first step. And for Chloe, this was it. The first step toward confronting the truth. The first step toward understanding her past and, hopefully, finding the peace she so desperately needed. As Chloe stood there, frozen in front of the house, the front door creaked open. A figure stepped out. Chloe's breath caught in her throat. It was him. Her father. Her heart skipped a beat. He looked older, frilier than she remembered, but the same haunted expression remained on his face. "Chloe," he said, his voice hoarse. "I've been waiting for you." Chloe stood frozen as her father stepped out of the house, his tired eyes locking onto hers with a mixture of regret and something else, hope. It was the last thing she had expected. All these years, she had assumed he didn't care. She had built an entire life around the belief that they had abandoned her without a second thought. But standing here, in front of the house she had once called home, facing the man who had once been her protector, everything she thought she knew felt like a lie. Her heart pounded against her ribcage. The air felt thick with the weight of all the unspoken words between them. For years, she had imagined this moment. In her fantasies, it had been an angry confrontation, screaming, crying, the release of all the pent-up emotions. But in reality, Chloe found herself unsure of what to say, uncertain about what she even wanted from this encounter. Her father took a hesitant step forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Chloe, I know you must be angry. You have every right to be. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, not yet, at least. But I need you to hear me out. Please." Chloe's mind raced, but her body stayed rooted to the spot. "You left me," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "You abandoned me without a single word. I grew up alone because of you. I spent so many nights wondering what happened, why you didn't fight for me." His face twisted in pain, and Chloe could see the years of regret etched into his features. "Chloe, you don't know the whole story. I didn't want to leave you. But I couldn't stay. It wasn't just my choice." She stared at him, confusion settling in. "What do you mean, it wasn't just your choice? What do you mean?" Her father looked away, his gaze drifting to the house, his eyes distant as though the memory was too painful to relive. It was never supposed to be like this. When we left, it wasn't because we didn't love you. It wasn't because we didn't want you. There were other things happening. Things we couldn't control. Chloe's head spun. What other things? What could possibly justify abandoning your own child? You and Mom just disappeared. You left me with nothing, and now you expect me to understand? He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his graying hair. It's not something I can explain easily. But you deserve to know. You deserve the truth, Chloe. Chloe crossed her arms over her chest, trying to shield herself from the vulnerability that was threatening to surface. Then tell me. What's the truth? Her father hesitated for a moment, then nodded. It all started when your mother found out she was pregnant with you. I was still in college, trying to figure out my future. Your mother, she wasn't in the best place emotionally. She had her own struggles, her own demons, and we didn't know how we were going to raise you. But we were determined to try. We thought we could make it work. Chloe felt her chest tighten as she listened, the story unfolding in pieces she had never imagined. Then what happened? She asked, her voice barely audible. Then everything fell apart, her father continued, his voice thick with regret. Your mother, she had a breakdown. It wasn't something anyone could have predicted. One night, she just lost control. I couldn't get her help in time. And the doctors, they told us she needed to be committed to a facility. A mental health facility. Chloe's breath caught in her throat. She had always known there was something her parents weren't telling her, but this? This was far beyond anything she had expected. She was sick. Chloe's voice trembled as she processed the new reality of her past. Her father nodded slowly, his eyes dark with the weight of guilt. Yes. She had been struggling with depression for years, but we never saw how bad it had gotten. By the time we realized, it was too late. They said she was a danger to herself and to you. That's why I had to make the hardest decision of my life, to send her away. I couldn't take care of you and take care of her at the same time. It broke me, Chloe. It broke me to leave you like that. Chloe felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her. She had always imagined that her parents had been selfish, that they hadn't cared enough to stay. But now, with every word her father spoke, the truth felt like a crushing weight she wasn't prepared to bear. But why didn't you come back? Why didn't you come for me after everything? You just left, Chloe whispered, her voice breaking. I didn't know how to, her father said softly. I didn't know how to fix what had broken. Your mother was in a facility for years. I visited her when I could, but she never got better. Every time I thought she was getting better, she'd relapse. And every time, I felt further and further away from you, Chloe. I felt like I had failed you. Tears welled in Chloe's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. You think you failed me? Do you have any idea what it was like to grow up without you? To think that you didn't care, that you just didn't want me? Her father's eyes welled with tears too, his voice barely a whisper. I never stopped caring. I never stopped loving you. But I was lost. I didn't know how to fix things. I didn't know how to be a father when I didn't know how to help your mother. I thought if I stayed, would only make things worse. The wind picked up, swirling the fallen leaves around their feet. Chloe stood there, her heart torn between the woman she had become, the survivor, the independent one, and the little girl who had once waited for her parents to return, who had dreamed of a day like this. The silence stretched between them, the heavy weight of years of separation pressing down on both of them. Finally, Chloe spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you ever tell me the truth? I should have. I should have tried harder. But I was afraid, her father admitted. Afraid that if you knew the truth, it would hurt you even more. I thought it would be easier to just disappear. But I see now. I was wrong. Chloe took a deep breath, her emotions swirling inside her like a storm she couldn't calm. She had waited so long for an apology, any kind of explanation. And now, she had it. But it wasn't enough. It never would be enough. I don't know if I can forgive you, she said, her voice trembling, but resolute. I don't know if I'll ever be able to. You took away so many years of my life. You made me feel like I wasn't worth fighting for. Her father's face crumpled, as though the weight of her words was more than he could bear. I know, Chloe. I know. And I don't expect you to forgive me now. But I want you to know that I am sorry. And I want to try to make it right. If you'll let me. Chloe wiped her eyes, feeling the heaviness of the conversation slowly draining her strength. She wasn't ready to forgive him, not yet. But something inside her had shifted. For the first time in years, she felt as though she was starting to understand. The anger was still there, but it was mixed with something else, understanding. She took a shaky breath. I need time. But I'll try. I'll try to understand. Her father nodded, his eyes full of gratitude. Thank you. That's all I ask. Chloe didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. She turned and walked back to the car, the wind at her back, carrying away some of the weight she had been carrying for so long. As Chloe sat in the car, staring out the window, she realized that this was just the beginning. She had heard the truth, but the journey ahead was still uncertain. There was a long road ahead of her, one filled with healing, understanding, and the possibility of rebuilding what had been broken. But for the first time in years, Chloe felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. Chloe woke up the next morning with a feeling she hadn't had in a long time, uncertainty. She sat up in the bed, staring out the window at the gray sky. Her mind raced with the conversation she'd had with her father the day before. He had spoken the truth, but with each word, it felt like the ground beneath her shifted in ways she hadn't anticipated. The anger that had fueled her for years, the pain she had buried so deep inside her, had been replaced with a strange mix of confusion and something else, compassion. She hated herself for feeling it. She had sworn she would never let her parents back in. Yet now, it seemed like the door was slowly creaking open, whether she was ready for it or not. She rubbed her eyes, trying to push aside the sleepiness, but it wasn't the lack of sleep that weighed her down. It was the lingering feeling that there was still more to uncover. More to understand. The truth had begun to surface, but Chloe couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something she wasn't being told. The thought gnawed at her. Her father's words from the day before echoed in her mind, it wasn't just my choice. There were other things happening. Things we couldn't control. She had asked him what those other things were, but he had never answered. His vague response had only fueled her suspicions. If her mother's illness had been the sole reason for their abandonment, why hadn't her father come back for her once she was old enough to fend for herself? Why had they stayed out of her life for so long, even when the situation seemed more manageable? The uncertainty stirred deep inside her, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. She needed to know more. After a quick breakfast, Chloe decided to visit the local library. She had no clear plan in mind, but the quiet hum of research seemed like the only way to clear her head. If she was going to move forward, she needed answers. And the library, with its shelves of forgotten stories and hidden knowledge, felt like the right place to search for them. As she walked into the familiar building, the musty scent of old books greeted her, a scent she hadn't realized she missed until now. It was strange, being back in a place that felt like a world frozen in time. She walked past rows of dusty volumes, her fingers brushing lightly against the spines. Rachel had offered to accompany her, but Chloe had insisted on going alone. The journey was hers to make, and she didn't want anyone holding her hand through it. It was her story, and she needed to confront it on her own. She made her way to the old section of the library, the one that contained local history and archives. It was a quiet corner, where the outside world seemed far away. The large wooden desk was covered in papers, and the librarian, a frail woman with glasses perched on the tip of her nose, gave Chloe a curious glance. "I need to know about my family," Chloe said, her voice steady despite the anxiety crawling beneath her skin. "I'm looking for anything related to my parents, to the time they were here. About my mom's illness." The librarian nodded slowly, as though she had heard this request many times before. "You'll find some old records in the back," she said, gesturing toward the row of filing cabinets. "But be prepared, it's not easy reading." Chloe's heart quickened. She didn't know what exactly she was expecting to find, but something told her that the past wasn't going to be as simple as her father had made it seem. She walked to the back of the library, her footsteps echoing in the quiet space. With each step, the unease inside her grew. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the first drawer. The old papers were yellowed and brittle, the ink faded with time. But there, among the dust and forgotten stories, she found a folder with her name on it. She hesitated before opening it, her breath shallow. It felt like opening Pandora's box. Inside the folder were documents, letters, and reports, each one more troubling than the last. The first was a medical report detailing her mother's breakdown. It described her mother's depression in clinical terms, but Chloe could feel the weight of her mother's pain between the lines. What had seemed like an unexplainable abandonment now had a face. The document painted a picture of a woman who had been struggling for years, a woman who had been unable to care for herself, let alone a child. But there were more records, more disturbing details about her father's involvement in the decision to send her mother away. One letter stood out, dated just days before Chloe was placed in foster care. It was written by a social worker. The words on the page were chilling. "Given the current circumstances, we believe it would be best for Chloe's safety and well-being if she was placed with a foster family. Her father is unable to care for her while her mother remains institutionalized." Chloe's hands shook as she read the words. Her father had made the decision to place her in foster care. All these years, she had thought her parents had just abandoned her, but now she knew the truth: her father hadn't just left, he had chosen to let her go. The anger she had suppressed for so long resurfaced in a wave of intensity. How could he? How could he have made that choice? She swallowed hard, trying to calm her racing heart. The answers she had been looking for were becoming clear, but they only raised more questions. Her eyes scanned the rest of the files, her mind swirling with the implications of everything she had just uncovered. It seemed like the decision to send her away hadn't been a simple one. There were references to her mother's volatile condition, her repeated relapses, and her father's inability to manage it. But one thing was clear: her father had made choices that ultimately severed their family for good. She felt a sharp pang in her chest, a mix of hurt, betrayal, and disbelief. This wasn't the picture her father had painted for her. He had told her that he was trying to fix everything, but the documents in her hand painted a very different story. He hadn't been trying, he had been giving up. Back at the hotel, Chloe sat in her room, the files spread out before her on the bed. Her mind was overwhelmed with everything she had discovered. The reality of what her parents had been through was too much to process all at once. She had always thought they had abandoned her out of cruelty, but the truth was more complicated, more painful than she had ever imagined. Her father hadn't been the villain in this story, he had been a man who had been broken by circumstances he couldn't control. But that didn't change the fact that he had chosen to let her go. And it didn't erase the years of pain she had lived through as a result. There was a knock at the door, pulling Chloe from her thoughts. She wiped her face, realizing she had been crying without even realizing it. When she opened the door, Rachel was standing there, her expression filled with concern. "You okay?" Rachel asked softly. Chloe nodded, though it was clear she wasn't. She stepped aside to let Rachel in, her heart heavy with the weight of everything she had just uncovered. "I found out the truth," Chloe said quietly, sitting down on the edge of the bed. "My mother was sick, and my father made the decision to send me away. He didn't want to, but he chose to. He chose it, Rachel. He chose to let me go." Rachel didn't speak right away. She just sat beside Chloe, her hand gently resting on her shoulder. For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them. "I don't know what to do with this," Chloe whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to feel anymore." The truth was raw, and Chloe wasn't sure she was ready to face it fully. But she knew one thing for sure: the journey was far from over. The deeper she dug, the more complicated it became. But there was no turning back now. She had opened the door to her past. And now, she would have to face it, no matter how painful the process was. This part further unpacks Chloe's emotional journey and reveals more about her father's difficult choices, which complicates her sense of betrayal and confusion. She starts to grapple with the complexity of her parents' decisions while questioning the extent of their love and care. The tension builds as Chloe begins to see her father not as a villain, but as a flawed man caught in impossible circumstances.